Today we'll start our study of Haridas Chaudhuri's book, Integral Yoga, the concept of harmonious and creative living. And we'll be considering the first two chapters, the meaning of yoga and the aim of integral yoga. So in the chapter, the meaning of yoga, Chaudhuri enters into a discussion of what is yoga and what is the place of integral yoga in the wider field of yoga. Today, as we know, the word yoga has become relatively ubiquitous in modern society, particularly in the West. Yoga has come to mean the physical exercises that are widespread in the form of yoga studios. And in these exercises, the idea is one of health and fitness largely. And it has become a major industry, the modern industry of yoga, that caters to a lifestyle which has some amount of health and ability to cope with the stresses of the world. But this is a modern and rather contemporary appropriation and reduction of the meaning of yoga. The West itself has got a number of uses of this term yoga in its history of reception. We can see all the way going back to the end of the 19th century with the Parliament of World Religions, when people like Vivekananda, as well as a number of other Buddhist, Sufi, etc. denominations participated, that the idea of yoga entered into the West. But that notion was more geared towards a kind of meditative definition. Later in the 60s, a number of gurus came to the West, and these gurus taught a variety of paths that proposed a connection with some other kind of consciousness, and hence called themselves yoga. One could see that the meaning of yoga became extremely pluralized at that time. However, a lot of these uses of yoga even then was swiftly appropriated into a matter of lifestyle or of some kind of maximization of some sort of human and cultural activity. And hence, we found diversification of the field of yoga, but also a gradual dilution and appropriation, as if these existed to just increase the capacity of our everyday existence under the aegis of capital. Today, as I started, we could see that the meaning of yoga has shifted once more, and today it is one of the health and fitness notion of physical exercises. But if we look at India and the meaning of yoga, we find that there is a plurality of yoga and a kind of shifting coexistence of the meanings of yoga in India itself. Many people have come across the word yoga as one of the 6 darshanas, Shat Darshan, as a specific type of Indian praxis. So that kind of a yoga is taken by many to be the original definition of yoga in India. It is primarily taught in the text known as Yoga Sutra by Patanjali, a text that will in fact be taught here in CIIS next semester, so in fall 2024. But what we're talking about is that the term yoga exists in a variety of forms, even at the time when the specific discipline called yoga took its name and took its form in India. So we find that, for example, the Bhagavad Gita talks about yoga in an interesting way, where the field called yoga, though I would consider it Bhagavad Gita to be prior to Patanjali, this is also the mainstream view, but what is called yoga in the Yoga Sutra already exists at the time that the Gita is written, so that the Gita fields its own arguments in terms of the two disciplines of Sankhya and Yoga, largely, along with other lineages like Vedanta and Bhakti or Bhagavata lineages that have come into existence at the time of the Bhagavad Gita. All of these are being proposed as forms of yoga. So the Gita is also involved in a kind of diversification or pluralization of the meaning of the term yoga in its own milieu and in its own time. So if we go back further to thinking about what is yoga and are there origins to this term, we start coming across much earlier references to yoga, sporadic and scattered references. The earliest references can be found in the earliest texts of India, the earliest verbalizations of India. They are not written texts. These are the Rig Veda. And we already find in the first volume of the Rig Veda, there are mentions of this term yoga. Yoga is talked about in terms of a yoking. So in Chaudhuri's chapter, one can find that Chaudhuri traces the etymology of the word yoga to yuj, which means to yoke or unite. So this yoking, and you can see the Indo-European cognate, yoke and yoga. So this notion of yoking in the Veda has two kinds of meanings. Firstly, the idea of a chariot. So many people have talked about the fact that the Veda represents a certain period of history, the Iron Age, where also the chariot with the axle has become a major technological innovation that is in use at the time. And in the Rig Veda, we have images of the sun which travels in its chariot, for example, or other gods that travel in their chariots. This is a very ancient use of the word chariot, or of the notion of the chariot, which we find also in early Greece, as well as we find this continuing in Indian religious practice, where in a variety of temples we find during specific festivals the deity being carried out in a chariot and traveling in a kind of circumambulation of the temple so as to come out to the devotees, just as the sun makes its round, as it were, in a relative point of view to the planets, and particularly the various areas of the earth in its motions, or as far as the earth is concerned, in the way in which the earth goes round the sun. So chariot can be used in the sense of a device which is related to either the divine or the deity. And we talked about the fact that the Veda is a solar or heliocentric mythos. So how is it that the relationship between the planets and other entities and the sun are maintained through a movement, which is a movement taking place through a chariot? We'll see how this idea of the chariot continues into a more sophisticated idea of yoga. But yoking the chariot, yoking the horses to the chariot, becomes a certain kind of a metaphorical idea that we start seeing in the Veda itself. And in certain uses, we see various um, variations or prepositional uses of the word yuj. In some cases, literally the word yoga or yogam being used there. Sometimes the fact that this is a metaphorical use is made explicit because it's not a chariot but human ideas and thoughts that are said to be yoked to the deity. The yoking of thoughts, the yoking of the mind to the deity Surya Savitri, for example, in a hymn in the fifth volume, hymn 81, talks about yoking of thoughts to the solar origin. And it takes us back to our study or our discussion about the sacrifice of Purusha being really an image of the solar descent into the earth. So there is a certain way in which the sun, in its entry into the earth, is a sacrifice so that it enters, it's swallowed up by the dualities of the earth. And it then forms the two worlds that we talked about, which is the essence of the Vedic system, the two worlds, also of many other systems. One, a transcendental world, which is heliocentric and permanent, eternal, is self-conscious, and the other, the geocentric world, which is the world of dualities, days and nights, fragmentation, where there are many instead of one, and the fact that each one of these is living in this world of dualities. So the project then becomes, how can these many within the world of dualities find their connection with the one? Find the fact that it is the one that has become the many. And somewhere the one resides in us still. The goal is not so much to go back to the one, but how to discover the one within the many, so that there is a certain kind of new type of manifestation, the truth of the dualistic world, which is that of the play of multiplicity with the unity within it. Because the unity is truly infinite, the play of the multiplicity is not a play of knowing the whole. It is a play of the emergence of new horizons in each particular interaction that one makes with the infinite one as one's center. So this kind of connection, which links the one and the many, or links the each, the all, and the one. There are these three realms one can talk about. The one, the all, which is the entire cosmic system, the each, which is each of the multiplicity, have to be known as one together. And this discovery is the yoking that is taking place. This is the central idea in some of these hymns of the Veda. And when we come to the Upanishads, we find that this idea is given to us in more concrete forms through the notion of the individual center as Atman or self, the one self that has pluralized itself into many selves, and Brahman, which is the one being that has individualized itself as the Atman. So the first of the Upanishads in which such ideas are discussed with the word yoga explicitly used is the Katha Upanishad. The Katha Upanishad is concerned with immortality. And by immortality, we can see, using the metaphor that I have presented, that the life which is covered in the dualities, which is lived in the dualities, goes through births and deaths. And these are our ontology. We experience a kind of emergence, an appearance, and then a disappearance of all things, including ourselves as the center of our own experience. But as we live, everything around us is also experienced in that form, and this is considered by many philosophies to be the center of our suffering. This is how the Buddha talked about it, that the root of suffering is impermanence. So when we think about that kind of an experience, that is our mortality, the death of a life that appears. So when the Veda or the Upanishad particularly is talking about immortality, amritam, mritam is death, amritam is the negation of death, immortality. What it means is, can we find that in us which even in the appearance of births and deaths is continues, does not really die, but appears to change, as it were, one's dress from life to life, is reborn. Can we find that entity that continues in us? Or going beyond, because even there we can talk about two kinds of immortality. One is a temporal eternity, that is, one is in time, but one experiences a movement that is continuous, though it seems to go through births and deaths. And the other is a permanent eternity which does not change. So this is again the two worlds, the heliocentric and the geocentric. Both of them are expressing the eternity, one which is unchanging, the other which through its changes is persisting. The Katha Upanishad, when it talks about immortality, this is what it means. These are the two kinds of eternities that constitute an integral immortality. And the idea in most of the Upanishads is, how do we experience both of them? How do we know both of them together, not privileging one over the other, but simultaneously experienced? This state, the heliocentric state, the helios as we may call it, which is hymned as the sun in the Rig Veda, gets this idea of the Purusha towards the end of the Veda, in the 10th book of the Veda. And this idea of Purusha persists in the Upanishads. So in the Katha Upanishad, immortality is going to be tantamount to union with the Purusha. And this union is talked about in a number of ways. One of them is as a chariot. How do we form the chariot that will take us into the orbit of the sun, or the orbit of the Purusha? Making this chariot means aligning or reconstituting our faculties. And that is how that particular portion of Katha Upanishad talks about yoking, the forming of an engine of becoming, a technology of forming something that is we don't experience in our everyday lives. So this kind of idea is related to yoga in the Katha Upanishad. And Haridas Chaudhuri is going to talk about yoga in a similar way, but he's going to shed all this background. It doesn't really go into much historical background, but interestingly, his understanding of yoga is the same, connecting us with an integral source, with the source that we've lost, with being. His definition right in the beginning is something that has a quality of Heideggerian language to it. And I'd like to read that part. It's very interesting. You can see how he is aligning ideas to make his presentation of yoga at this point. So he's talking about the basic issue of being human, and he says, Atman, in our present age, the basic issue of human suffering, including moral, religious, and psychological problems, has been traced to one ultimate cause, to wit, self-estrangement, alienation from existence, loss of contact with being. Emotional conflicts, social disorders, political wars, all these in the final analysis flow from man's loss of contact with the ground of existence. Now he in parenthesis equates that with Atman or Brahman. Alienation from existence makes him outwardly oriented to the point of restlessness. This, in fact, is a kind of a approach, an ontological approach, starting from Heidegger, that enters into ontological psychotherapy. So the cause of our restlessness is the loss of our contact with the ground of being. That's how he's putting it, alienation from existence. He fights, makes him out. He eagerly looks for his happiness in the outside world. He fiercely fights for the blessings of life with rival contestants. He desperately searches for truth as an object of contemplation, as a thing to think about. So contemplation is an objectification, according to this way of looking, an objectification of our understanding of truth. He seriously endeavors to settle his accounts with fellow beings by means of objectivized principles, pacts, and agreements. He forgets that the crux of his crisis lies within himself, in the buried discrepancies of his own nature. Yoga calls attention to this crucial fact. It aims at that vital existential experience which reunites man with the inmost center of his own being. Of course, Haridas Chaudhuri is writing this in the 60s, and you can see the thought climate of his time, continental thought particularly, influencing the way in which he talks about it, and also, of course, the masculinist language, the way in which he equates the human with man, which was pervasive in his time. So this is a certain frame of address that belongs to the time of Haridas Chaudhuri's writing that is interesting to study, particularly in terms of the continental sources of his ideological alignment. He also identifies the problems. As we see, he begins in this very beginning to identify the problems that modern man is beset by. He talks about them as generalized problems, but later in the very early parts of that chapter, he identifies our contemporary problems, or contemporary problems of his time. And many of them are very pertinent to us, and in fact have grown even more exaggerated in our time. So I'll quote that part. He says, "In our present age, the problem of man's alienation from existence has reached fearful proportions. Modern man is in great danger of being crushed by the machines he has himself created. He is in danger of being lost in the crowd. He is faced with the danger of being swallowed by authoritative institutions, giant corporations, and monstrous dictatorships. Intensified struggle for existence leaves him little time for coming to terms with his own inner self. Ideological conflicts and international tensions have vastly accentuated his sense of insecurity. Enlightened modern man can hardly fall back upon the mercy of the old gods, that is, traditional values of medieval thinking embedded in supernaturalistic dogmas and creeds. The old gods have died, even though the tragic news has not yet reached the orthodox and conservative segments of humanity. Not all those who have heard the news are quite aware of its full significance. The reassuring voice of the new gods is not yet clearly audible. Yoga points to the truth beyond the gods of different races, nations, and parochial religions. It affirms the reality of the self, Atman or Purusha, as the one beacon light in the enveloping darkness of conflicting creeds and ideologies. Yoga is existential appropriation of the truth. At its best, it is also an act of manifold self-expression of the truth. We call that integral yoga, which we shall discuss at some length in the following chapters, unquote. So we can see over here that a lot of these facts, the way in which he presents the problems of his time, are extremely contemporary. We can see the problem of technology, we can see the problem of institutions, institutional control, or we can see the problem of dictatorships and state control. These are in fact talked by Sri Aurobindo himself. They're present in Sri Aurobindo's writings, but they are more exacerbated by Chaudhuri's time and even more in our time. Not much has changed. Other things have come in its place, that there are more pressing problems in our times. So apart from capitalism, technology, and superstition, we now have ecology. We have the tremendously pressing climate crisis. We have neoliberal globalization, which is really the displacement of colonialism. We have ethnocentrism. And what he calls the dying of the old gods is hardly the case today. We can talk about the return of the old gods. So this is an interesting situation where we find that the problems Haridas Chaudhuri is encountering are with us still, along with other and even more powerful pressing problems. And the integral yoga that he is presenting and talking about in terms of a addressing of these problems continues in that sense to be very relevant to our times. So Haridas Chaudhuri goes on in this chapter to compare yoga with a number of other disciplines, and particularly since he's addressing the West, disciplines as they are understood in the West. Some of them are translations. When we talk about religion or philosophy or ethics, these terms exist in other cultures as well, but what they mean, the approximate, cultural approximate to this term, these terms are not the same. There are nuances that make them quite different. So as far as yoga is concerned, how do they stack up? This becomes the question that Haridas Chaudhuri is investigating in this chapter. And he talks about a number of disciplines or aspects of life, such as religion, ethics, philosophy, psychology, and mysticism. He starts with religion. And of course, today, again, the word religion is a contested term. There are various ways of looking at it. It's a fuzzy term. We have the notion of the varieties of religious experience, for example, which William James is talking about. Religion can be seen to be a field of spiritual experience on the one end of the spectrum, and of creedal adherence and obedience, and a identity which is exclusive at the other end of the spectrum. And he is pointing to, particularly starts with pointing to the creedal identification related to religion. And he's presenting the fact that as far as yoga is concerned, it does not believe in any specific creed. It believes in the relativity of all creeds. That we touched on this, and as far as this idea of religion is concerned, in one of the earlier lectures on Haridas Chaudhuri's other book, The Prophet of Life Divine, I quoted from Sri Aurobindo, where he's referring to Vivekananda, who was grappling with this very problem, the problem of multiple religions in the world, and the fact that he was looking for a universal religion. So Haridas Chaudhuri reiterates this idea of universal religion. and he points to the fact that the universal religion, just like what Vivekananda was saying, is universal not in being one religion that everybody has to follow, but in universalizing itself as a plural process of approaching the divine. Each individual is unique. Each individual's preferred point of contact with the heliocentric origin, if we want to call it that, is unique. And each individual's process by which they may become integral, including other parts of faculties in their contact, is also unique. So all these become, as it were, factors of plurality. What's universal is the fact that each individual is looking for an integral experience or realization of the one that is not necessarily bound by what some one teacher said or what one particular field of religion identifies as its truth. That would constitute a universal religion that connects with the field of yoga as it has developed in India, where there are innumerable paths. None of these paths remain fixed. They do develop certain emic envelopes, one may say, and at the same time they stretch those envelopes and often create various in-between intermediate layers that take them out of what they started with. They are not held accountable, as it were, to some kind of a ecclesiastical authority, so that they renew themselves through new experience, and each one of them diversifies over time, while some maintain a certain elastic contact with some body, a canon, as it were, and some don't. Now from this, he goes on to the idea of ethics, and he points to the fact that a number of these schools of yoga have a component of ethics. Many are familiar with what are called the yamas and niyamas of the Yoga Sutra. These are ethics, but he points to the fact that these are, even in those yogas, considered to be a kind of self-regulation that belongs to an early stage that can bring us to a point where the ethics is not needed, a kind of beyond good and evil stage. Ethics overall are considered a prescriptional system, and in many yoga schools they dispense with ethics as such. Sri Aurobindo does not necessarily have any particular ethics. To live in the Sri Aurobindo ashram, there are some rules, but these rules do not apply to other habitae where the integral yoga may be practiced. In other words, these collective, the prescriptions for a collective life, which constitute a sort of a ground basis by which a collective may not step on each other's toes, is variable depending on the kind of collective, their collective expectations, and also their stage in development. Ultimately, what Sri Aurobindo is pointing to and what Chaudhuri is pointing to here is that the ground of ethics, the foundation of ethics, is the experience of oneness. And all other kinds of ethical foundations which are prescriptional should be challenged as one enters into greater sense of inner oneness or inner sympathy, inner empathy, inner understanding with others in a collective, with a certain goal, which I discussed in one of the talks pertaining to the Prophet of the Life Divine, in what the mother calls collective yoga, where each individual is aiming to enter into a state of experience where others are experienced like themselves as a fact of consciousness. So this is the way in which that goal moderates our understanding of any prescriptional system of ethics. There is also a hearkening to the Gita's idea of ethics, which has to do with one's swadharma, which is more like what are we to do in life is not so much a question of what we are told to do in life and how we are told to do it, but to follow the intuition of what brings one the deepest joy connected with some universal source. And I made a relationship with Joseph Campbell's famous statement, follow one's bliss. This also can be related to Spinoza's ethics, where Spinoza is talking about ethics as an individual praxis that ultimately leads one from a state of separation to a state of universality and then a state of identity. The Gita's approach is very similar and can be compared. This is the basis of ethics that takes us to an experience of oneness, and which is definitely beyond any external idea of good and evil. Chaudhuri goes on to relate yoga to philosophy. So here, philosophy again, when we think about it in terms of the ideas around this term that have developed in India, there is a term for what we may call philosophy in the West, and that is darshana. But that has many differences from what is called philosophy in the West. The idea of philosophy in the West, philosophy as metaphysics, particularly if we go back to Enlightenment philosophy, metaphysics is a kind of thinking from first principles of experience to the essence and relations of reality. We think from first principles, and in other words, we don't make assumptions. We engage our thought with the nature of our experience in its depths and arrive at a understanding of reality and our relations to reality, within reality, through this process of thinking. Yoga philosophy is not of that kind. So firstly, what is yoga philosophy? Yoga philosophy is not an attempt to look at to discover or to enumerate, enunciate a universal scheme of cosmology or metaphysics. Yoga philosophy is firstly subordinated to a goal of becoming. In other words, one is trying to arrive at a state of unity or a state of oneness, and however one formulates that based on a dynamic understanding of what one needs and the steps that one needs to take constitutes the way in which one builds a cosmology of relations. And so this cosmology of relations is subordinated to the idea of becoming and reconstituting what is given. This means that yoga, if we talk about a yoga philosophy is not interested or does not even affirm a cosmos that exists in its essence as a static something. It builds terms that are important to it for its own goal, and it creates a system that will help it to achieve that goal. Now, in terms of Western philosophy, one can compare this more fruitfully to a change or revolution in the kind of metaphysics of philosophy that I'm talking about, which ultimately is an action of thinking and can only remain an action of thinking with its own conditions and limitations. These conditions and limitations are perhaps best expressed through the critique of the reason that Immanuel Kant gives us. So that gives us the conditions, as it were, of philosophy. what are the bounds of philosophy. But these bounds have been challenged within the West as well. Even from the beginning of people like Schopenhauer, who's displacing the idea of cognition at the center of philosophy to the will. Of course, for him, the will is an inexorable will that we can't do much about. But Nietzsche, who works in the shadow, I'd say, of Schopenhauer, but also deviates significantly from him, talks about the shift from cognition as a center of philosophy to the will, and the will to power at the center of philosophy. He points out how all our schema of what is are infected by the will. Somewhere we want to know, or we want to establish a certain kind of knowledge and make it universal so that others also follow it. So there is a certain type of action of the will. And from a static essence, Nietzsche considers a dynamic becoming. So this idea, this critique carries on into modern and contemporary continental thought. It carries on in the thought of Heidegger, for example, who is concerned with destroying metaphysics, and with Derrida, who changes that to the term from destruction to deconstruction, and to people like Gilles Deleuze or Henri Bergson, who are speaking explicitly about the will to becoming, creating problems of becoming as the foundation of philosophy. In these ways, we'd say yoga philosophy, today that term is much more used. During Chaudhuri's time, yoga philosophy was not a term. Today it is used because there are a number of academic disciplines of yoga studies in contemporary academy. So yoga philosophy is a type of philosophy that aligns more properly to the problematic of becoming that is enunciated by people like Henri Bergson or Gilles Deleuze as the foundation of philosophy. Chaudhuri goes on to relate yoga to psychology. And here he says that yoga, to quote him, yoga is a science of human personality in its integral unity. So human personality in its integral unity, if we think about psychology as a discipline, as a Western discipline, it begins with therapeutic implications. It begins with wanting to normalize the human from its pathologies. So if human beings have pathologies, how can we normalize them? By studying what are the problems that they're going through. As a result, it also comes up with models of the psyche. These models of the psyche are certain types of understanding of what makes the human. The methodology is different. It may arise out of some kind of an experience of pathologies, as it does in the case of Freud, or it may arise out of empirical studies of averages. What does it mean to be human? You look at the behaviors and characteristics and arrive at a certain average and say, this is the human psyche. But yoga does not accept any of these, because yoga's aim is not the psyche as it exists, but the psyche as it may be reconstituted. So Sri Aurobindo, in the synthesis of yoga, in fact, makes this connection with yoga by saying yoga is nothing but practical psychology. So this idea of practical psychology comes up over here. And by practical psychology, he means that it is neither a normative psychology nor a positive psychology. Normative psychology is how can we create an image of the human psyche which is the norm, that we have to somehow make everybody into, and that allows us to behave in a way that is acceptable to the boundaries of the human. And a positive psychology means we have such a kind of a psychology where we can consider the correct real relations of the psyche or the constituents of the psyche to be scientifically so, and that is a positive psychology. A practical psychology is neither of these, because it is actually talking about becoming something else. And what do we want to become? Each yoga has its own notion of how it wants to constitute or reconstitute the elements of the personality. And therefore, it is a practical psychology from that point of view, and the ability to operate on these elements to make them what one wants to make them. This operation is again not a cognitive operation. It is not an operation with the mind or using the mind, but it's in that sense more an art than a science. There is a creativity of the flowing, as it were, with the forces. And this again takes us to people like Bergson or Nietzsche, where learning, instead of some kind of a idea of something that is teachable, is the ability to arrive at a practical psychology. The other aspect is that yoga considers the individual not as a sort of a bounded psyche, but as a psyche that is in a constant relation with the outside. In other words, there is no real outside. The individual is a porous expansion that becomes the cosmos. So in yoga psychology, we can talk about a consciousness, a science and art of consciousness all the way down. In other words, that some people have used the term a cosmopsychology. A cosmopsychology means cosmic consciousness, which is not individual or psychological, is related and part of the individual consciousness. Transpersonal psychology, which Haridas Chaudhuri doesn't mention, is one of the fields that opens up with the aim of calling into being this kind of a yoga psychology. So that is the way in which we have to see the relation between yoga and psychology in our times. Finally, Chaudhuri considers the relationship between yoga and mysticism. And he talks about mysticism as direct personal realization of the fundamental truth of existence. But he also says that mysticism, as it is understood, is a field of experiences that does not necessarily have a technique to be reproduced. Mystics enter into altered states. They may enter into altered states through numinous experiences, contact with various external forces, expansion of their own consciousness through the use of substances or other kinds of connections. And they may normalize this as well due to the fact of its repetition, but they don't necessarily give us a technique. So he says, he quotes, when mystical insight is carried sufficiently deep, it becomes a great creative factor in human living. So yoga is more concerned with giving us a method, though the method is again flexible and is individually experienced, so that there is a creativity to the use of the frameworks that are given by yoga. And the experiences that it gives, once one normalizes them, it becomes deep enough, they become the foundation of a creative life. So this is the way in which Chaudhuri wants us to understand yoga in terms of its ability to make a difference to life. And as he'll point out in the next chapter, that's not necessarily how yoga is seen. Yoga is often seen as a technology by which we can escape from life, by which we can be free of the suffering of life, not make a difference to life. But that's one of the ways in which the integral yoga is very different. In other words, it wants to make the possibility of a transformed mainstream life that is creative, that is arising out of one's contact with the deepest sources of unity and oneness that each individual can develop for themselves. This is what Chaudhuri is calling creative living, harmonious and creative living. That's why he's seeing yoga as and the way in which he formulates it, he's seeing yoga and integral yoga as a power in transforming life. Now, one other point he takes up in this particular chapter is that the notion of the annihilation of an egocentric individuality. And something needs to be understood here, because Chaudhuri doesn't parse it sufficiently. And it seems as if this is like most of the other yogas where the individuality disappears. But in the next chapter, chapter, Aim of Integral Yoga, he's clearer about this, that the integral yoga is not about the disappearance of the individual, but a transformation of the individual, which becomes cosmic and creative. The self and the ego, what is the relationship between the two? What we normally call the ego is bounded in separation. We are the center of our own existence, and we have limited resources of understanding anything outside ourselves. We translate everything into our own terms, and that is our notion of what the world is. But in yoga, that particular separative center is replaced by something which is more cosmic, that while it is unique, each individual is completely unique, is also a universal reality, so that whatever we encounter is a paradoxical difference in unity. We experience the world as a kind of a horizon of the one. Everything is facing us as a kind of a wonder of one's own infinity, so to say. So that is the way in which Chaudhuri means the notion of the annihilation of egocentric individuality, not the absence or dissolution of the ego, but its transformation or its replacement by a deeper center of individuality in us. Now, the second chapter in this text is called the Aim of Integral Yoga. Now, it starts with the idea of a middle path. Integral yoga for Chaudhuri at this point is something which integrates the different faculties. So the middle path that he's talking about is that do not go into any extremes in the exercise of your faculties. That is, a person who is predominantly cerebral, for example, loses contact with the creativity of life or with the abilities of the body. This is largely what happens in academia, for example. The demand on the cerebral powers is so great, and along with other forms of white-collar work, we are made into cerebral sedentary workers of the world, and our body suffers. In many, many ways, we spend long hours sitting in chairs and working in such a way that the body hardly gets any exercise, etc. So from that point of view, what Chaudhuri is saying, that mind, emotions, will, body, meditation and work, all these need to be balanced and integrated. However, yoga, integral yoga, the goal of integral yoga is not balance. The goal of this is only from the viewpoint of making sure that one doesn't lead a lopsided life. The goal of integral yoga is to arrive at something integral which expresses itself through all these faculties. In fact, Sri Aurobindo also makes it clear that some schools feel that we need to first attain to that one consciousness, the heliocentric consciousness, through deep meditation, and then bring that into contact with life. And to some extent, in his writings, it seems that certain things that he says moves in that direction. But he's also very clear that that's not the way to go, because he says that if one spends a lot of time trying to meditate, etc., that atrophies all the other faculties. It atrophies our emotions. It atrophies our will. So to engage all of us in life, all of our faculties in life, and to allow each of these faculties their independent contact with the search for the integral, is the way that integral yoga privileges or proposes. The goal is the expression of the one in each. So the idea is, Sri Aurobindo actually uses this term, unequal distribution of force. It's the distribution of the equal in itself which is unequal in its distribution. This is something that the philosopher Gilles Deleuze is also talking about, that it isn't so much that everything has to be equally distributed. The play of difference in the world occurs through the university of the one that is not reduced from being the one in the inequalities of its expression. Every expression, more or less, of its ability to express is the same one. So that kind of an integrality, which is the unequal distribution of force of the one that is the only one, is the basis of the play of multiplicity that the integral yoga is talking about. Chaudhuri then goes into talking about life and yoga. And he has a quote there which talks about a resolute will to allow the power of being to work more freely within us. So again, here life and yoga relates to the fact that, as I said earlier, there is a kind of a tendency in looking for something deeper to negate life. And that is not what either Sri Aurobindo or Chaudhuri are proposing. They're talking about the fact that the power of being must work more freely within us. The power of being is constrained in our everyday actions. So how can we find a greater power of whole being as a creative force in our lives? Here he also talks about the levels of cosmic awareness. We have come across one way of looking at the levels of cosmic awareness already in terms of these levels of cosmic mind that mediate between our rational mind and the supermind. But levels of cosmic awareness need not only belong to the mind. They may belong to the emotion. They may belong to other faculties that also, in a sense, form alternative paths of expansion and maybe the preferred route that integrates other faculties as it moves along. So whatever they are, there has to be a growth of cosmic awareness that takes place and brings about new perspective, values, and yogas, so that there are unique approaches to increasing or expanding the levels of cosmic awareness in all of us. And Chaudhuri is looking at this from the viewpoint of the field of life as a universal field, and particularly modernity as a universal, ubiquitous ontology, where individuals of various types, various cultures, are various unique orientations towards reality are all coming together. And he's talking about, to quote him again, dedicated souls the world over should discover a common meeting ground and a way of cooperating towards the fulfillment of the common destiny of humankind. So this is an integration, and it's interesting to look at it in this way, to look at it not in terms of individuals who need to arrive at an integral consciousness by individual assent to the universal, but simultaneously to engage with others who are unique approaches towards that same universal and transcendental consciousness, so that in our contact with others we complement our own understandings and our own proclivities, whatever it is that is the strength, the swadharma, or the unique approach towards the divine in each of us and in each of our faculties includes strengths and weaknesses. And it is in a field of relations that we can actually complement that which we do not possess to integrate ourselves better. This is a approach towards what the mother calls collective yoga. And I spoke about this earlier in terms of the fact that though Sri Aurobindo sees a limited utility of collective yoga until one has emerged into a greater consciousness, the mother sees the immediate utility of it. One has to practice this enlargement through relations as an aspect of one's individual growth. Next, Chaudhuri talks about the inadequacy of an ascetic ideal. And we have already prepared towards this. We've been prepared towards this in his talking about life as the field of expression of our contact with being. And here he takes up some of the traditional paths, particularly paths in India, but also paths in the West and outside. He talks about the via negativa, which is also known as the apophatic way, the way by which we negate whatever we've experienced to come to a transcendent. So that is carried out in India through a variety of schools. He mentions Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, where Yoga and Sankhya both talk about their goal as Kaivalya. Kaivalya literally means exclusivity. So there is an attempt to subtract and go to something so exclusive that nothing, it's extra cosmic, it's transcendent to the cosmos. It's the same with Brahma Laya of Advaita Vedanta that Chaudhuri mentions, as well as some forms of Shaivism, such as Shaiva Siddhanta, which talks also about Kaivalya, aloneness or exclusivity, or of arhatship in Buddhism, particularly Theravada Buddhism. So he's saying that these kind of goals, which are monastic and separative goals, exclusivistic goals, are not of use in transforming life. And so he's talking about the creative joy of becoming as an important aspect of the engagement of yoga, so that the freedom that one experiences as one enters into contact with a greater universality is used to have a creative output in the world. He quotes Sri Aurobindo, who speaks about a double movement of ascent and descent, ascent up to the supermind and descent down to the body, not about stopping. This is not done in a sense that, as I mentioned earlier, one transcends and then comes back. It is not a linear temporal process, but a continuous ascent and descent. Because, as I said, if one goes about it in a temporal way, in a linear temporality, one doesn't have the ability to interact with the world once one has made oneself so transcendent and rarefied with one's contacts with the world. So this ascent and descent has to be simultaneous. Chaudhuri then talks about the transformation of existence. And here again, he goes back to the world negating schools of yoga and talks about a ladder which has stages in each of them that one uses to climb to the top, and then one kicks the ladder away after reaching the goal. This is also like the multi-staged rocket that I mentioned in one of my talks on the Prophet of the Life Divine, where one uses each stage as a booster for the next stage and then drops it, as it were. But in the integral yoga, this is not the way. Every rung needs to be simultaneously employed in becoming universal and transformed by the consciousness of every rung above it, so that there is a change, a greater universality, both a horizontal and a vertical transformation that takes place. As far as the body is concerned, this goes all the way down to the body. Sri Aurobindo deals with this integral system of the psyche in his own yoga. And this forms this is what we find in his diary called the Record of Yoga. And he also deals with this in the fourth part of his major book, Synthesis of Yoga, but it is incomplete. He doesn't deal with the whole of it. As I mentioned, a lot of his work is incomplete. So in the Record of Yoga, we find the schematic that he used in his own life called the 7 quartets, Sapta Chatushtaya in Sanskrit and 7 quartets in English. Here he encapsulates his goal of becoming in terms of the Gita. And we've spoken earlier about a particular verse from the Gita, which is looking at the Vedic sacrifice, the fire sacrifice, in terms of an internal process, which is, as I said, like an engine of becoming. And this particular verse, which many people know, many people in India recite it while eating. It goes Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavir, Brahmagno, Brahmanahutam, Brahmaiva tena gantavyam, Brahma karma samadhina. So all the constituents of the fire sacrifice are equated to Brahman, the one, the infinite one, the plural one, the integral one. So that is present in every element of the sacrifice. The sacrifice is not an external sacrifice that's going on, a fire sacrifice created outside. It could be, but it's primarily being internalized. All these constituents are inside us, and each one of them is being equated, connected to Brahman. And the hymn ends with one particular equation. It says, Brahma karma samadhina. Brahma karma samadhina means samadhi here does not mean a trance in which one becomes extracosmic, goes outside the creation. Samadhi here is a synonym for yoga. Brahma karma samadhi means the absolute union of Brahman and work. So in a way, it's Chaudhuri's definition. How can the roots of our action be our reconstituted union with being? Being is Brahman, or integral being is Brahman. How can the roots of our action be the outflowering of integral being? So here, this particular formula, if we look at these two terms, Brahman and karma, being and action, this becomes the center of the integral yoga. Integral being and action becomes the center of Sri Aurobindo's enunciated goal of becoming for himself. But each one of these has got other properties, as it were, that become an aspect of a certain kind of what one calls mandala or yantra. A yantra literally means engine. Yoga is a technology or an engine of becoming. So, whereas when we talk about Brahman, for example, Brahman has got two qualities, two principal qualities: oneness and knowledge by identity. Oneness is its essence, knowledge by identity is its expression. So, to know Brahman, we also have to include these two qualities with it. Again, to know action or action that is divine, each of these becomes a yoga, as it were. The yoga of Brahman, the yoga of knowledge, the yoga of oneness, etc. Here, the yoga of works, which the Gita talks about, which is the karma part of it. But karma has two necessities for its activity, and these are power or Shakti. What are we going to use for work? It's the divine force, Shakti, which becomes its own yoga, the yoga of Shakti, a tantric yoga. And the body, which is the body, is the foundation of our action, or Sharira. So each of these becomes a yoga that tends towards its own perfection. The perfection of the body, for example, in Sri Aurobindo's description of it, includes physical bliss, paranormal powers, and the overcoming of disease, arogya, ultimately leading to physical immortality. These are tantric goals. Even physical bliss for him is parsed over here into 5 forms of physical bliss. They include such forms as the ability to convert all pain into bliss. He's saying over here that whatever we experience in the body as pain is a failure of the capacity of the body to bear the intensities of bliss. It's bliss that is active in the world in every case. The fact that we are unable to bear its intensity is translated in our experience as pain. So if we know how to act on it, it turns into bliss again. Again, there are other forms of bliss, a kind of electricity in the body that he talks about, a kind of even an erotic jouissance, which is constantly experienced in the body, etc. There are 5 types of bliss. There are paranormal powers of physicality, and there is the ability to overcome disease. These are aspects of the yoga of the body, along with the yoga of Shakti, that form the preparation of a action, a yoga of the will, as it were. All this ends with dynamic union with being. This is what the aim of the transformation of existence as integral yoga is, as Haridas Chaudhuri is pointing out over here. From here, Chaudhuri moves to the collective liberation of mankind. And here, as I said, collective yoga is something which takes the individual realization into a field of collective experience and realization. But when Chaudhuri was writing this, he was writing, the original text was published in the 60s, early 60s in fact. Auroville had not been created. The mother had not created Auroville. Even the term collective yoga was not used in a distinct manner at that time. So Chaudhuri is in some sense extrapolating from the writings of Sri Aurobindo this notion of collective yoga. And he talks about it in terms of the collective liberation of mankind. So the idea of the collective liberation of the human is something that needs more provisional understanding. Chaudhuri's understanding of it needs to be nuanced. One can ask questions about it. One has to see that this is how he understood it at that time, and it need not be the final way in which the integral yoga understands it. Outflowering of the divine in collective humanity will certainly be a goal of the integral yoga, but how it comes about, how does the process move from our present to that future, is a good question that one can think about in different ways. So here Chaudhuri looks at the past and looks at other attempts to form collectives and ideas of collective liberation. He looks at Buddhism, and in each of these traditional yogas he's also looking at two sides, one which is denying the collective and the other which is empowering it. So Buddhism, for example, has the notion of the Pratyeka Buddha, which is a more isolated, individualistic achievement that denies the collective. On the other hand, Mahayana Buddhism comes up with the notion of the Bodhisattva, which is a ideal where the individual does not stop at the nirvana, but stops before the nirvana to help others come to a state of liberation from ignorance. Similarly, he talks about Vedanta and uses the term Sarva Mukti over there, the liberation of all. And this again is a bit questionable. It's not all schools of Vedanta or even the Upanishads that propose Sarva Mukti, but indeed there are ideas of that kind. Similarly, he comes to Christianity and talks about the kingdom of heaven. And in each of these cases, he says these ideas are open to interpretation. In some cases, they are extra-worldly achievements. One comes to a heaven outside the world, or one arrives at a state which is heavenly after whatever we experienced has been expunged. There is no transformation as such. This is on the ground of a ruined earth, something new arises. This is how he sees it. One can even talk about Hinduism in those terms, though he tries to make out that Hinduism is talking about a transformed ideal condition. In general Hinduism, we're right now going through what is called the Kali Yuga. And the Kali Yuga ends in a pralaya or destruction. And some schools are going to say it ends in a transformation into a fulfilled age called the Krita Yuga. So this is the ambiguity in these ideas. He also talks about the notion of the evolutionary force as the serpent. The serpent is a symbol of the evolutionary force, and he talks about how some traditions like the Greek or the Christian see a destruction of the serpent or giving a negative value to the serpent. While in Buddhism and Hinduism, there's the idea of integrating the serpent. He gives examples of the Buddha and of Shiva in this notion of integration. Then he moves further into this idea of the collective liberation of mankind by talking about collective liberation as a reign of dharma. So this term dharma, which gets a lot of prominence in the Gita, is what Haridas Chaudhuri is discussing in this this section of the second chapter, the Gita and Dharma. Here we have to understand something about the paradox of dharma. Dharma literally means that which keeps the world together. Dhri is to hold together. Holding together has a negative connotation seen in a certain way. Fascism is a holding together, for example. And if we talk about a holding together which is based on ideals, then we go to war for it. The Gita is talking about a war, dharma yuddha. It could easily be misconstrued as a ideological fascism. However, there is another way of looking at it, which is really the struggle of ethics. Sri Aurobindo himself was an anti-colonial activist, and he thinks about Dharma, that which holds together, as arising only through the freedom of the individual. So it's only when we live in a condition of complete freedom that dharma can outflower. Again, this is the notion of the integral as one and infinite at the same time. So the divine will is something which needs to be experienced for this purpose. And therefore, one may say that each individual is faced with this question of the Gita. What is the thing to be done? The question that Arjuna is asking Krishna in the battlefield. What is the thing to be done? The karyam karma, as it says. This is what Sri Aurobindo himself was looking for in his years of anti-colonial activism, and what put him into the field of yoga. He entered yoga trying to find an answer to how can I get unerring direction from within, from a source of unity, not just any voice, but something that is self-evident as an integral source that is at one with the world. And so this is the collective liberation as the reign of dharma, is one which enables the freedom and also enables the teaching that causes people to experience dharma as a living fact in their lives. From here, he goes on to think about modern political ideologies. Again, when Chaudhuri is writing, this is the era of the Cold War. And the world is split into a world of capitalism and communism. Now, of course, we have a world of capitalism. This is the neo-colonial world of global capitalism. And within it, we have varied ethnocentrisms and relativities of religion which are contested against each other. It's a different scenario, but no less dangerous than when Chaudhuri is writing in an impassioned way about these pitted ideologies. Now, one of the things that Sri Aurobindo talks about, Sri Aurobindo writes a book called The Ideal of Human Unity. When towards the end of this book and in some of his other writings, he is holding out a possibility, which is the possibility of world union. So he's saying over here that one of the ways by which we can think about the overcoming of our conflicts in our times is if we arrive at a kind of United Nations that is empowered enough to maintain peace in the world. This has not happened. When Sri Aurobindo was in his last years, the United Nations arose, and in a way it's the second incarnation of what started as the League of Nations after the First World War. It has been beset by power politics and has never been able to take off as a force in the world. Sri Aurobindo was seeing world union not as an imperialistic world empire, but as a confederation of nations that creates voluntarily an organ like the United Nations and gives force to it to maintain peace in the world and to maintain factors of world union, so to say. Now, Chaudhuri is moving in that direction. He doesn't mention it explicitly, but he's talking about that as a consequence of integral yoga that is practiced universally. Of course, I do not see integral yoga as being practiced universally in our times or in any foreseeable future or even maybe at all. But Chaudhuri talks about a unique world order ruled by spiritual values. Even if, forget about integral yoga, there is a idea of a shared humanity with an ideal of a integral spirituality. There could be the possibility of a holding of the values of life to be sacred much greater than today. war between nations is a sacrilege. If we think about it, it's really something that goes against the very grain of our being. As humans, as people with a certain modicum of intelligence and with a sense of the value of life. A couple of hundred years from now, in the 19th century, life was much more precarious. If you went out into the street, there was no guarantee that you'd come back alive. By consensus, you could arrive at a situation where somebody who is offended challenges you to a duel, or even worse, they could just kill you. Life was not considered valuable enough, as it is to a much greater extent now, that humanity has checks and balances that are severe for preventing easy exercise of one's power over somebody else's life. However, this has not happened at the level of nations. At the level of nations, we go to war with impunity, and large numbers of lives are lost due to some collective ideological cause that means nothing either to the individual or to our integral destiny, our existential questions or searches. This must come to a stop, and it can only come to a stop if humanity as a whole decide that it's time for it to stop, and creates the organs, political organs, supranational organs that can maintain this condition of a unified world order that is not an imperialism of one or a collection of powerful nations, but a confederation choice of humanity as a whole. This would be one direction. It wouldn't be a kind of consequence of integral yoga, but it would certainly make the possibility of a greater life for humanity more possible. But as far as the collective liberation goes, what Chaudhuri is talking about is not necessarily what Sri Aurobindo is talking about. What the mother created later, which is an experimental community, can be replicated. Others can form communities of this kind, which are communities of choice, like Auroville, other communities. Today, Auroville is also beset by severe interference from above by government. But this does not need to be the case where in all experiments of this kind, they need to happen, and the ability to move towards the possibility of a collective experience of the integral is something that is open, and which Chaudhuri's text is inviting us to consider for ourselves. Thank you.